Well, our next guest predicted the collapse of Germany months ago, or perhaps even over a year ago, and he was absolutely right. Now we are seeing the fruits of that, the fruits of that craziness by these green energy policies, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline that led to the destruction of the industrial manufacturing sector inside of Germany. Now the German government is collapsing. Olaf Schultz losing a no confidence vote. Now a snap election set for February. Germany is really in deep, deep trouble. Could be the worst since World War II. Ralph Schulhammer, academic researcher, predicted all of this. And if anyone was paying attention, you could have seen the writing on the wall a long time ago. Ralph joins us now to talk what's going on here. Ralph, great to see you. Feel vindicated?
Thanks, Clay. Thanks, Clay. Well, I mean, I feel a little bit like the guy who's constantly predicting rain, and then finally the streets are wet. And I have to admit, I mean, you flatter me, and of course, who am I to dispute your compliments? But I think as many of your viewers and listeners know, I mean, everybody who had eyes to see, it was clearly obvious that the German model of the last 4.5 years, and we can even go back probably to 2015, was no longer sustainable. So it didn't take, I wish I would say it took a genius to see it, but I think for both you and I, it was quite obvious that at some point the bill will come due. And I think now this is happening. The question is, with the implosion of the government, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this in greater detail in a second, the question is, are they willing to really turn the ship around, make a 180 and try something new and do the right thing? Or is it just a debate whether they're going to go over the cliff, with 100 miles per hour or just 80 miles per hour? And I'm not entirely sure what the answer to that question is.
Right. Fortunately, this has never happened to me, but, people that get, end up getting in trouble for like drunk driving or doing something incredibly stupid like that, you hope that they turn their life around and it never happens again after they spend time in prison. Right. And maybe that's the case here. You hope that they learn from this. Yeah. But I'm afraid that they won't. What is your sense of things? Well, first, we'll get into the pieces of what led to this collapse in a second. But are you hopeful that they'll learn from this?
Not during this election. My hopes are on the next election. The reason for this is because the leading candidate of the Conservatives, and the Conservatives are predicted to come in first quite substantially with around 30-31%. And second will be the AfD, like we talked about, the so-called Alternative für Deutschland, the alternative for Germany, quite a bit. They're probably going to get about 20% of the vote. So they would be in a wonderful position to have a real right-wing conservative coalition government. But unfortunately, the Conservatives already said that no, we cannot go into a coalition government with the far right and the extreme, all the terms we hear constantly. We heard about Meloni and Viktor Orban and Donald Trump. It's always the extreme MAGA, mega, ultra-right, and you cannot get into a coalition government with them. Unfortunately, they are the only party with whom the Conservatives could actually enact conservative policies, because what they are saying now, and their leading candidate Friedrich Merz is saying, well, it might going to be a coalition with the Social Democrats. It might going to be a coalition with the Greens. Yeah, but these both parties were part of the current failing government. So what exactly does he think? Yeah.
You're going to put the same. Yeah. You're going to put the same drunk driver back in charge. Like, that's my point. How are you going to have a coalition with the same people that destroyed your country, the Green Party, and otherwise? Quite
literally. He even mentioned in an interview 2 weeks ago that it's not yet out of the question that Robert Habeck, right, the Green Minister of the Economy, who is personally responsible for some of the worst decisions in German history, and Merz said, well, I cannot rule out that he might not remain the Minister of the Economy in a new government starting next year. I mean, this is insanity, and it's the same kind of, I always call them the lukewarm right. And the thing is, you and I, we live and breathe politics. But many people in Germany, they want a course correction. So they say, okay, the left was in power. So if I want change, I just have to vote for the right, and then the right will be in power. I think what they don't know is, because they don't interact with political news all day, is that the quote-unquote so-called right is in fact just a milder version of the left. As I said before, they're on the same mistaken course. They just get there a little bit slower. You need to vote for a true alternative, and that's a little bit the problem in the parliamentary system. Although on the other hand, everybody knows the rules of the system, so that is not an excuse. At some point, the voters have to take responsibility, like they did in the United States. This is the encouraging sign from the US. Trump was elected, then he was voted out of office, or at least it appeared as if he was voted out of office in 2020. But then I think a couple of months ago, the American people really made a decision and said, no, we want something new. We want to try something different. And this is why they voted Trump back in. And you can, by the way, I don't want to switch the topic to the United States, but you can sense, like, a business sentiment, the optimism is, I think, up by 36%, no, by 41 percentage points. And there's a general, I hate this term because I'm not in my 20s anymore, but there seems to be a positive vibe and optimism. You can almost sense a newfound energy in the United States, both literally in the energy sector, but also metaphorically among the population. And this would also be needed for Europe, but the people are not yet fully willing to vote for those parties who I believe could make that happen.
Yeah, it's troubling. I mean, in the United States, you're seeing, of course, President Trump announcing the massive rollback of all these regulations, which will open up manufacturing, bring business back to the United States, and really encourage, a newfound optimism in the manufacturing and industrial sector in the United States, in the mining sector, the drilling sector, oil and gas industry, the minerals sector. I mean, the United States outsourced all of this stuff, and we have no uranium production in the United States. The Biden administration and Democrats really destroyed the United States in many, many deep ways. It's not just Biden. It goes back to Obama and Clinton, of course. And so he's got a lot of work to undo all of this. And I think I'm very positive about that. I really think that Europe still has its head up its proverbial ass right now. I mean, forgive my language, but the young people in Europe, I think, are really starting to wake up. But you've got this, I think, an older class that's still getting their mainstream media digest every day from the propagandists. And I don't know that they're willing to turn a corner here. That's really, really troubling.
No, you're absolutely right. And the issue is, right, you have two entrenched layers, if you want, of an old school elite. One on the national level, right, the Olaf Schultzes, the Angela Merkels, I would also call it the Emmanuel Macrons among them. But they have an additional layer above them in form of the European Union, right, kind of this cadre of unelected bureaucrats. And that's a very, very powerful status quo elite that, at whatever cost, they don't want anything to change. They want to see the car go over the cliff as long as they can remain in charge. And as you correctly pointed out, and then they also kind of unify against those who would like to do things differently, like Viktor Orban, like the AfD, like Nigel Farage in the UK, like Le Pen in France. But you have all these elements now of lawfare, right, where they kind of try to ban the AfD, to put Le Pen in jail and ban her from running for office. So it's very disturbing what's going on. Now, my hope is that these are, the last throes of a dying regime, of a dying elite. They kind of put everything they have on the table now, but in the end they will lose. But the question is it going to be quick enough, or will they drag their defeat out long enough so it's going to be too late to actually have a course correction?
I mean, how bad is it? I mean, let's just talk about some of the pieces of Germany's economy right now. It's manufacturing, in deindustrialization, the energy crisis. How bad is it right now in Germany and in Europe at large?
Well, if we look at the situation in Germany, overall, I think that the question is always, could things be changed if somebody wanted it? Like, if politics would create the right conditions, could there be a German renaissance, if you want? And I think the answer is yes, because it is true, and that's a problem all over Europe, that in some of the major areas, artificial intelligence, the genetical engineering, AI, like all these kind of things. Now also car manufacturing, heavy industry, that Europe has been losing ground quite significantly. I mean, Turkey is now building more cars than France. But the question is, can that be reversed? And I think the answer is yes, because you still have many of these so-called hidden champions, like, small-sized, medium-sized enterprises that are still quite good. And many of them, like in the case of Germany, but also in the case of France, I mean, they survived 2 world wars. I mean, one could also say, okay, the Europeans have nothing new. They only have these old 19th century companies, which is true. But there is still something there you could build on for now, because these companies, as you mentioned correctly before, they are suffocated under excess regulation. They are suffocated under taxes that are just too high. They are suffocated by the fact that smart people leave Europe and unskilled labor is coming in. But these are all things you could address. So I come always back to my previous argument. As long as you have an elite that wants to maintain the failing status quo, you have a problem. And at some point, because we cannot entirely kind of free the voting population from their own responsibility, if people don't vote in substantial enough numbers for the alternative, you're not going to get an alternative. But I think there is still a chance for things to get better. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry, but I think you see my point. I'm just not entirely hopeless.
You're forgetting even just World War II and the legacy there, and a lot of Europe sort of clings to to the history. But there's some amazing brands that have just been devastated.
Oh yeah.
Husqvarna, Volkswagen. You've had these amazing companies that have a long-standing, place in the world that have now had to close up shop. You've had, lay off thousands of people as a result of these policies. And these brands are known worldwide and carry incredible gravitas. If they were allowed to do their thing, people would still buy their cars. People would still buy their leaf blowers from Husqvarna and these other companies, right?
I think that's true. Of course, a little bit these companies made also mistakes because they made a bet, right? And their bet was, if we get into bed with government, we no longer have to serve the market. We no longer have to serve the customers. We just have to serve one customer that's much more easy to predict. And that's the government, that's the state. And that strategy failed. And the other problem, of course, and that we have to say, is also a mentality issue. There is this idea in Europe, right, that at the end of the day, ideally everything comes from the state, right? Your health insurance comes from the state, your pension comes from the state, and in an ideal world, your job will come from the state as well. That is a mentality issue. So what we see now, for example, happening in Argentina, and we'll see how Milei's experiment is going to work out. But to say, no, this is not how the world works. By the way, the same in the United States. This is not how the world works. At the end of the day, people must live their own lives. And there is a sense in Europe that as much as possible, and that also came from the people, it's not just the fault of the elites, that they tried to outsource as much as they could to public institutions and the state. So the reversal must happen in the realm of economics, but the reversal must also happen in the realm of culture. To say you need to be entrepreneurial again. You need to found companies, right? All these also in the high school and university system. You mentioned these companies that all came up in the 19th century, but there was also a time when Europe had some of the best educational institutions in the world. Right? The Germans in the 19th century had the world-leading universities when Harvard more or less was a boys' club. No offense against Harvard, but the point is that you needed these other institutions, the educational system. At the moment, these institutions are attacked sides. One is from a kind of leftist Marxist indoctrination. It's from mass migration, where you then end up with schools like in Vienna, like I'm living in, like in Vienna, where 90% of pupils don't speak German. So there's a lot that would have to be fixed, and that's my big fear. Is so much at some point that unless you really vote the quasi-revolutionary party into office, this is going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, we lived in Portugal for a while, and it was amazing to see just the lack of entrepreneurship there. It's just not taught. It's just not part of the culture. And it's very difficult to start a business. The amount of paperwork and bureaucratic red tape to try to go through that process is just a nightmare. There's no discussion among young people about, hey, I'm going to start a business. Like, it's just not part of their young culture there. Really, and I don't know that that's the case across, I think it's probably the same across Europe. I don't hear that sort of entrepreneurial spirit, is it?
Yeah, I mean, this is a major issue. This has always been a key problem in Europe compared to the United States, this over-excessive reliance on the government. By the way, you saw this already in 2008. That's kind of always my favorite example. In 2008, during the great financial crisis, you had people get into the streets in Europe demanding the states do more. In the United States, you had the Tea Party movement that demanded that the state does less. And I think this exactly shows you the difference. In the United States, to some extent, I think it's a little bit different in the big cities. It's a little bit different in California, I would assume. But overall, the understanding of Americans is that if there is a problem, you have to solve it yourself, or at least that should be the attitude. In Europe, the attitude is, again, not everywhere. I think Poland is slightly different. I think the Scandinavian countries are turning the ship around much more than how they're usually represented. But overall, the idea is if there's a problem, the state has to solve it. And that's, again, as I said before, this has to change. Like, governments in Europe at the high time of Europe in the 19th century were not constantly involved in people's lives, right? They were involved abroad. They did imperialism and maybe all these supposedly horrible things, but they more or less left people to their own devices, unless, like the beginning of the welfare state in Germany, they were too old. They were, they had health issues or something of that kind. What was always the idea of the welfare state? The state should help those who cannot help themselves. But if you're an able-bodied 25-year-old individual, man, you're responsible for your own decisions. And if you decide to do 20 semesters, 10 years of gender studies and lesbian dance theory, that's your choice. You cannot expect then everybody else to take care of you.
Lesbian dance studies. If my kids ever come to me and tell me that's what they're going to study at university, I'm going to ship them off to Europe. They'll fit right in. They'll fit right in. Oh, man. Well, we'll be watching what happens here after the holidays with these snap elections in Germany. And is Europe continuing to dig its own grave? It seems like that, amassing these forces right now on the Russian border, putting as many forces as they can to try to go to war with Russia right now. So they're not backing off anytime soon, it doesn't seem. They're trying to dig their own grave. Ralph, great to see you. Ralph is the host of Hammer Time. Hope you enjoy your Christmas holiday. Thank you so much for all of your analysis and insights, and thanks for being correct. You nailed this one. Thanks, Ralph.
Well, thank you so much, and also Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to you, your family, and of course all your viewers and listeners.